Hello, everyone. This is Roger Capello, bringing you my week at the club, episode number 36, I believe, from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. And I have an interesting game to bring to you this week in the last round of the club championship. And I was playing against Ray Paulson. But first, a brief timeout here for this weekly's astronomy corner, if you will. So the picture over there on the right-hand side in the center is actually a curious thing that was I just read about recently, and it has to do with an asteroid that's in a very peculiar orbit, um, roughly out in the same space as Jupiter. Now, the thing that's odd about it is that it's actually orbiting in a retrograde direction. So it's going the opposite way from the way that all the planets and almost all of the asteroids are going around the sun. It's headed in the other direction. And that's unusual. First of all, how does it get to be in that orbit? That's a whole separate talk, I suppose, that I don't really have time for right now. But also, how does it maintain that orbit? Because since it's in the same orbit as Jupiter, you'd think that it would suffer a collision at some point, or at least have its orbit sufficiently perturbed by the mass of Jupiter that it would get thrown off. And instead, this is in a very stable orbit. It's called BZ509, and it has an orbital period exactly that of Jupiter's. And this little plot here is hard to understand, I think. So I won't spend too much time on it, but this is this green circle in the center is Earth's orbit around the sun. And this is this circle here, this black circle is actually Jupiter's orbit around the sun. And they've shown it in a way that that it's Jupiter, the frame, the picture is rotating along with Jupiter in its orbit, so that Jupiter stays fixed and everything else rotates relative to Jupiter. And in that frame, you see this BZ509 actually orbits in the opposite direction. And in one Jovian year, it actually it will pass it twice, because it'll pass it once on one side of the sun and pass it on the other side of the sun as well. And the way it keeps from getting thrown out of orbit is interesting, because it has an eccentric orbit. It's not, as you can tell, it's not a perfect circle. It's an ellipse with about 40% eccentricity. And so that on the first passing of the Jupiter that happens at this point in its orbit, it's actually outside of Jupiter. And then when it comes around 6 years later, which is half of a Jovian year, it's actually on the inside of Jupiter's orbit because of the eccentricity. So both times it misses Jupiter. It's also in an inclined plane. You can't really tell that from this photo. And the thing that makes this all happen is a phenomenon called resonance, which I probably shouldn't try to talk about now, because it's a whole topic in its own. Resonance in the solar system is what makes the moon have the rotation that it does. It's locked with one face toward the Earth, and Mercury is locked with a day that's 2/3 of its year. But it also affects orbits of planets like the Jovian satellites, and in this particular case, this asteroid BZ509 that's locked in a resonant orbit but counter-rotating relative to Jupiter. So that's probably more than enough time on that. I'll get back to my chess with Ray here. Ray and I were club champions last year, and this year I sort of fell by the wayside with a loss and a draw coming into this round. But Ray had a perfect score with 5-0, and he had even beaten Brett Kildall, who's the one that beat me. That was my loss. And so Brett was kind of hoping that I would play the spoiler here and beat Ray. So the two of them, I guess, would be co-champions. But rather, I guess this is sort of the fish that got away, or maybe even better, this is the fish that let one get away, because I had it in my grasp here, and it was an exciting game, which I'll show to you. So it started out with d4, and quickly, let's see, get control here. d4, d5, c4, so queen pawn opening. Ray played a Slav defense against it. We've entered this before with knight f3 and knight s6. And then I played knight c3, which is a standard move, and he accepted the pawn. Now, the most common move at this point is just to play a4 to prevent black from holding on to this pawn. But I played e3, which seemed to me at the time like I could probably regain the pawn without much effort, even if he tries to hold on to it. And that's true. If you look at some of the lines, if black tries to hold on to the pawn, say with b5, then white has lots of leverage to try to tear apart that pawn structure. It's not stable enough. So white can play a4, for example. If black pushes the pawn, then the knight has to go somewhere. Could go to a2. And now from a2, it's attacking the pawn that was on b4. It's also this pawn that's on c4 is under attack by my bishop. And you can't really easily say both. If he decides to develop and save the b pawn, then I could simply take the c pawn. And if he really tries to cling on, to dear life with this to this pawn, it just doesn't work. I mean, there are various ways that he gets a real disadvantage in the position. So back here, instead of that, he played bishop to f5. So I went ahead and recaptured the pawn. He played e6. I castled, developed the bishop. I developed my rook to a central file. He castled. And now I have enough control over the e4 square. This was being threatened, of course. Last move. That I can go ahead and play e4. And Ray played bishop to g4, setting up kind of a troublesome pin on my knight. The only game in the database that I could find in this previous position with after white's pawn to e4 actually had the bishop dropping back to g6. So instead he played the bishop to g4, which I think might actually be a better move. And it's a novelty. It's the first time that I've seen that one, or the database has seen it. And I responded to it by strengthening my control of the d pawn. Of course, the threat here is simply that he could trade off the knight, and if I recapture with the queen, which I would probably want to do to keep my pawn structure intact, I would lose this d pawn because the knight was a defender of it. So in order to hold on to that d pawn, I played bishop to e3, and at this point, Stockfish says that there's a small advantage for white, about a half a pawn or so, which seems about right to my eyes. He played knight b knight to d7. I attacked his bishop in order to make lift for my king, also to give me the possibility of absolutely breaking that pin at some point in the future with g4. Of course, he could have traded off the knight at that point, but I would have been happy with that. And then I played queen to e2. Now, the evaluation drops a bit at this point. Computer is not so fond of this move. But my rationale was that it completes my development, gets my two rooks together. My queen has to go somewhere, and from this position, where am I going to go? It's I don't have many choices. Anything I do other than, if I remove my queen, other than going to e2 is going to allow him to hurt the pawn structure. I suppose I could have considered queen to b3, attacking this pawn on b7, but that's not really something you want to consider, because if nothing else, there are moves after I take the pawn, like rook b8, and then the rook would attack through the queen and down to my b2 pawn and capture it. So it's not the kind of initiative that I want to give to black at this point. Plus, somewhere along the line, he would trade off the bishop for the knight and, again, hurt my pawn structure. So that's why I played queen to e2. It does give him the chance to immediately gain some tempi attacking my pieces, but my bishop on c4 right now is um, is it's a reasonable post, and so on this diagonal, but it I mean, because reasonable in the sense that it is pointed at the white king. The only problem, of course, is that these two pawns on the white squares are quite strong for black on these. Oops, that's not the one I want. Try that again. There we go. So, no. It's always hard to manipulate these things. The pawns on e6 and f7 are a strong formation there, but at some point, I had been hoping to maybe get in d5, supported by my bishop. But now I decided that it was more important to drop back and protect the e pawn because I don't want to lose it. So I do that in view of the fact that his next move is likely to be b4, which it was, driving my knight away. Now, at this point, the knight, does it get driven away or not? Well, Stockfish would like to see the knight get driven away. That his best move is to, according to Stockfish, is to do something like play it out to a4, and then to support it with pawn to b3, and use that knight out on a4 to help exert some control over c5. That in conjunction maybe with the rook to c1. That's a good plan, and probably better than what I did. But I was kind of intrigued by the tactics that follow after e5. And there's nothing great about the tactics here, as long as black doesn't step into something that he shouldn't. He can take the knight, but of course I take his knight back. And now a mistake would be to take the pawn on b2, right? Because I would take his bishop. Okay, I just want a piece there. I'm a piece up, and the queen and rook are under attack. And no matter what he does here, he ends up losing substantial material. If he takes my rook, I could take the rook check, and he'd have to recapture, and then I'd take his newly formed queen. But even better would be to take the queen, and if he takes my rook check, so what? I take his new queen back. Right, and so I end up in material in that variation as well. So instead, really the only reasonable move at that point is to go ahead and take that c pawn. And now there's just been a trade of some pawns, and it's helped his position a little bit in that it got this knight off of d7, where it was congesting his, was restricting his view of the half-open D file here, and instead traded that for my knight, which on e4 was, or on c3 was, maybe at some point going to make it to e4 or whatever. So, that probably was to the advantage of black. He moved his knight, attacking my bishop. I didn't want to trade it. Well, also this pawn was under attack, so I could drop it back and defend that pawn at the same time. And he moved his queen off the file, preparing to, presumably, to bring a rook over to the d file here, since it's half open. So at this point, I chased his bishop away, like I was talking about before. I wasn't too worried about my king safety. He doesn't have a lot of pressure against my king side. And chased it back to g6. And that was a move the Stockfish liked. That was its first choice. But then it wanted a follow-up with bishop takes bishop on g6, slightly hurting his pawn structure on the king side. But instead, I took the time to advance my knight to e5. And this, he didn't, this threatens knight takes bishop on g6, and he can't drive my knight away by pushing the pawn, because I'll take the bishop and then my queen could come in check. It would be rather messy. So instead he traded the bishop on d3, and I took back with the queen. He attacked my knight, and I took the time to drive his knight out of the center. So let's scroll this up a little bit for you. Okay. He dropped back to E7. And then I moved my queen off of that file. Part of my thinking there is that he's going to have a rook posted on D8 very soon. And I had my queen and bishop both well, the queen was defended by the knight, but weakly defended. And the bishop was not really defended once the queen moves. Weak pieces here, so that would give him some leverage to, say, attack along the C file. I didn't want that to happen. Also, the E4 is just square is a little more active for my queen. So he followed up with his posting his rook on that half-open file. And I put my bishop on F4, which is an active square. It's threatening to take something with tempo with my knight because his queen would be attacked. So in order to dodge that, he played his queen to B6, which is fine with me because it's at some point I'll be able to attack the queen along this open B file. Although right now, if I did that, he's attacking this pawn on D4 twice. So I didn't really want to give him time to do something like this. So instead, looking at this position for a while, I realized there was a neat little tactic that would win me a pawn. And that was to take the pawn on F7 with my knight. He can give me the pawn. Actually, he could take the B pawn here at this point, but that looks risky. And if nothing else, this pawn on E6 is going to be extremely weak. Instead, he went ahead and took my knight, and that allows my queen to come in with check. He really only has well, he has two legal moves, but he doesn't want to pin his knight on by moving to E8. So went to F8 instead, and part of the combination still is that I can play G5, and that bishop has nowhere to go. So it's a trapped piece, and he took on D4 with it, which then allows me to take the knight. So I get my piece back, and I've won a pawn in the process. So I have 5 pawns to his 4. And his only legal move was king to G8 at that point. He was in check. And I proceeded with bishop to E5. The problem is, Stockfish actually likes a line starting with bishop takes F2 check. And only slightly better, not by very much. But I didn't like the looks of that because of the fork, obviously, of the king and the rook. And also the fact that my king would be, king safety would really go downhill. So instead, by bishop to E5, that's basically putting him into a very tough spot because it's forcing the trade of bishops. Because if he were to take, well, at least I believe this is true, that was my analysis at the time. I'm threatening checkmate is the point. So here on G7, the queen is threatening checkmate. So if instead he played bishop takes pawn check, what I was planning was to move to a square where he couldn't check me, say king G2. And now what can he do about the checkmate? So at this point, he can give away some pieces, like rook D7, and I take it, and then the queen to D7, and I take that, and so on. But it's going to eventually wind up in checkmate. And the only move he has at this point, let's look at 2 lines. Yeah, so if I stop it there, you'll see that there's one variation here that's just about even, where he trades off the bishops, and the next variation down, he's behind by 12 points because he's had to give away major material to try to stop the checkmate. And it doesn't even work. If I let it analyze for longer, it would, I think, find that was a mate. So instead, he goes ahead and takes my bishop. I recaptured with the queen. I could have taken with the rook. I liked having the centralized queen that was more active. There's something to be said for both. Taking with the rook would have, in this position, would have allowed me to triple on the e-file. But it was, a little bit scary because he could play rook to f8 and be immediately threatening a strong counterattack on f2. So instead, by playing queen takes, I'm now threatening to come here check, and he really can't afford to do that. So instead, he played pawn to c5, which allows him to control this e5 or e6 square rather, so that my queen can't come in check. And I took the time to go ahead and develop my other rook to the b file. This queen has to move. And then I attacked the pawn twice. Now, this is the beginning of sort of a defensive series of moves. And it turns out that at various points, being a little more active with his pieces would have been a better line for black. Instead, after I traded queens off with queen to e6 check, now he got ready to defend that pawn twice. For example, at this point, a stronger move would have been to go ahead and play his rook down to d2 and threaten my a pawn. And so, sure, I'm going to win. I think what he didn't like. So let's take a look at that line. So if he plays rook to d2, I can defend the a pawn. But he could attack the f pawn twice now. Okay, and there's no way for white to defend that. So it's going to drop. You could play f4. So let me just check to make sure I'm not blowing smoke here. Okay, so best move is rook to d2, which is what I was suggesting. And after rook to d2, oh, a4, yeah, a4 is better. Rather than putting my rook on the a file, instead advance the pawn. Passed pawns need to be pushed. And if he gets behind it, for example, like this to attack it, then I can push it again to a5. And each step I'm taking is getting me closer and closer to promoting that pawn if and when I win that pawn on a7. So after rook f8, though, he's not in too bad a shape. You know, rook takes c5 and oh yeah, because he doesn't want to have problems with the back rank. So he actually has to take with the a pawn, the a rook. Okay, so I mean this is this is still a game that could go to either one of us. I think complicated with the two rooks. So we'll step back. Let's turn off this engine and clear the clutter a little bit. So what he did do was play rook to c7, getting ready to defend that pawn. Again, I attacked it twice, and he dropped into this defensive posture instead of having an active rook. That allowed me to start improving the position of my king. So he attacked my rook. I moved it over. I can still keep the attack. Now I'm attacking his a pawn, so he defended that, but that gave me another tempo to move my king. So white's advantage now, as you can see, is up to over +2. So Ray decided to improve his king as well here at this point to get it active. Has to get it out in the center of the board. But there's a limit to how far he can go, and that's it. And whereas meanwhile, I can make progress with these very mobile pawns I have on the king side. So f4, played his rook to the 7th rank, preparing rook to e7, I imagine, at some point. I can play f5, further restricting his king and also making my pawns more mobile by making them abreast of one another. He's really kind of in a tough spot here. If he moves either rook off of the C file, I'll immediately be able to take the C pawn. But that may have been the best alternative. Instead, he marks time, king to f8. So I'm able to further centralize my king. King to f7, h4. And now, rather than to remain passive, and plus, given that I have cooperated by putting 2 pawns on the 4th rank here, 2 undefended pawns, he takes this chance to get the rook to the d file, where now he could play the rook down to d4 with check and pick up one of these loose pawns of mine. So I took his c pawn. I made this. I remember making this move sort of rapidly. I was getting into significant time pressure already, and I decided to keep the pressure on the a pawn by taking with my rook that was on e5. The problem with that is that well, actually, let me stop and think a minute here. Yeah, actually, now that I look at it, it didn't make a difference. He's going to be able to do, whichever rook I use, he's going to be able to do the same tactic that he did, which is to play rook to d4 check. Okay, and the king moves, and he takes the pawn. Because he was attacking that pawn twice, once directly and once through my rook. And so he's able to win it, and I could take either one of his rooks. And I took the rook on c6 so that he would no longer be attacking my pawn on h4. Possibly I should have taken the rook on c4, and then I could immediately have taken his a pawn. See which one Stockfish likes here. No, it likes the c6. See, if I took the other rook, rook takes c4, it's about +1.5. If I do it this way, it's 1 point. Yeah, it's not very different. So either way is roughly the same alternative. Back when I was looking at this a minute ago, what I was seeing was that if I had taken with the other rook here, oops, let me turn this off, then he could still have come here check, and after my king moves, taken the pawn with the same tactic. And if I were silly enough to interpose my rook, he could just take check and win my rook that way. So that's why I didn't do that. So get back up to the present here. So he took my rook, or took the pawn on my rook on c6, I guess it was. And so that now allows my king to get in position to keep his rook from penetrating my king side. But he came over and is now threatening to come down anyhow and check and come through to my h-pawn. So I want to prevent that. A much better move here would have been the one that's getting suggested, which is the king to c5, right? Because then, quiet, that's Zelda. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, I think she stopped barking. My wife just came back, and that's a lot of excitement. So there she goes. Right, so where were we? After king c5, if I had done that, the rook is under attack, and he can't penetrate on this b4 square. And it turns out, if you look at it, there aren't any squares for his rook to go to on the 6th rank. So my pawns have all 4 of these squares under control. My king has these 3 squares, and of course my rook controls that square. So there's no place to go. The rook would have to go off of that rank, and then I would have won his a pawn at this point. So that would have been a good move. I didn't do that though, unfortunately. Instead, I played the king over to c4. Of course, I was starting to get in significant time pressure at this point. And Ray played the interesting move h5. Taking on passant didn't appeal to me as it ruins my pawn structure. And once again, I had that same move I could have made a little while ago with king c5, but instead I played the rook to c5. And the advantage dropped significantly, although white still has a winning advantage at +2. He dropped back to the 7th rank to keep my rook from penetrating on the 7th rank. So I pushed the a pawn, which I'm hoping will soon be passed. He started to come over with his king, but there's a limit to how far he can come. Now, when I attacked his pawn, that unfortunately allows him to advance it, because I'm no longer controlling the a5 square, and now he's threatening to come down with his rook to b5, or to b4 rather, check, and pick up one of my pawns on the 4th rank. So I came off of the 4th rank so that move wouldn't be with check, and so when he comes down to the b4, it allows my rook to come back to defend. But first I drove his king back to the 8th rank, a little Zwischenzug here, and then drop back. Just a little subtlety. Now, actually, in this position right here, before I dropped back to defend along my 4th rank, I was tempted to play rook takes on g7, because it would give me the 2 passed pawns on f5 and g5, and connected passed pawns. And they're pretty far advanced, and with my rook and king up there, it looked like that would be a real problem for him, and it would be. But I didn't make that move. So instead, it would, if I'd done that, it would look like, oh, sorry, that's the wrong move. There it is. So in this position, if instead of dropping the rook back to defend the 4th rank, if I'd gone ahead and taken on 7th rank, there are a variety of ways the game could have continued, but one moderately forcing line, at least forced at times, certainly not forced right there at the first move, would be, for example, if he takes the h pawn, then I can advance the g pawn, which starts to threaten various kinds of mating possibilities. His rook moves, so his h pawn could move. My rook gets out of the way. He pushes his h pawn. I start to build well, I'm threatening a couple things. Threatening to promote a pawn or to have a mating net on the back rank there. He pushes the pawn again. I could threaten to get a queen. He could come over and defend against that, but there's a check with the f pawn. The king moves, and now there's a back rank mate. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that could happen. But I only had 5 minutes. At this point, Ray had 7 minutes. We had both been short of time for a little while. I had been quite short of time, and Ray had about twice as much as me. But then the last several moves, he had been thinking a bit more as things got kind of dicey, and now we were almost even in time. I was still on the short end, though. So back to the game. I played rook c4, there we go. Defending my 4th rank. He dropped back to defend the 7th rank again. I came over with my king to help out with the pawns. He checked. I stepped up, and he played king f7. And at this point, I could kick myself for not seeing, you know, when I went over the game at home, I saw this immediately, but playing in blitz mode over with the clock ticking down, for some reason, I didn't see the possibility of just pinning his rook and forcing the rook trade. So I could have played rook c7 here. And now he has to take it, otherwise he loses his rook. So he takes it, and I take back. And this is, you know, this wind is very, very easy, right? I can run over and get the a pawn, and he can't come over and try to keep me trapped on the a file, because then the f pawn will just march home, and he could trade it off, but it's still going to turn into a queen at some point. And if he tries to stop that, then my A pawn goes in. So that would have been an easy, easy win, one I could have done on the delay time. But I didn't do that. Instead, I played, in this move, I played king to C. In this position, I played king to C6. Wanting to come over after his A pawn. But of course, that keeps things still a bit complicated, although it's still a winning game for white. I defended my 5th rank. He went to the 4th rank, and finally I said, go ahead, take my H pawn. I'll try to win with the passed A pawn. So he took the H pawn. I checked him. He has to go to the back rank. And I played my king over. Now, once again, there are various lines that lead to easy wins with king to A8. I'll just type through the computer suggestions very fast here. And they're all plausible moves. Check. My rook stops his H pawn, and there's no way to stop these F and G pawns. And there are multiple wins at this point, but I did not find one of them. I went to E5. His rook dropped back to defend the back rank. And unfortunately, as it says in my notes, I stopped recording the game here. I had 3.5 minutes on my clock, or 3 minutes, something like that. And if you look at the Stockfish evaluation here, it's at plus 17 and is climbing. The longer I let it go, the higher the evaluation goes. It should have been an easy win for white, but it wasn't. And we got down into a very, very rapid blitz session. Basically, I was a little careless in the way I handled these pawns, and I ended up trading off the F and G pawns for his G pawn. So he was left with an H pawn and his rook, and I was left with my A pawn and the rook. I came down with my king and was able to stop his H pawn, but eventually we just traded down to the bare kings. The 2 rooks went off. And I only had 3 seconds on my clock at that point, so I was trying to move fast. And when I came home, I could recreate many of the moves and the basic theme of what we did, but I couldn't get the exact move sequence, so I didn't enter that into PGN. So that was the game. I failed in my bid to stop him. It just ended up in a draw, but it was an exciting draw, and Ray played very well. He ended up winning the tournament with 6 wins and a draw, gaining 50 points or so on his rating, and he'll be the sole club champion for this next year, the 2017 club champion. So hearty congratulations to Ray for a well-played game, and I'll get another chance next year. So long for now. This is Roger signing out.